Hey, howdy, hey. How's it going, folks? Just checking out to make sure everything's all kosher here. Looks like we're okay. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? I'm Dustin Cormier. You're watching How to Rock Astrology. Today we are continuing our reading of Stephen Arroyo's Astrology, Karma, and Transformation. It's a classic Western text that combines many different cross-cultural experiences of how to integrate all the many themes, many little bits of astrology, this and that planet and this and that house and this and that sign, bring it all together to one concise experience of what all the little things mean to this immediate moment for an individual. Right now we're in the chapter relating to karma. Chapter 1 is karma in this book. This is our mandala associated with it. We're going to continue now going into the specific chart factors. In our previous episode, we talked about the guts of the philosophy, the essence of the philosophy of karma, what it means psychologically, what it means esoterically. Now we're looking at specific chart factors that relate to what karma is, what it means, and how these certain figures in the chart are the holders and expressors of what karma is, and the different dimensions of karma in the birth chart. Now, to continue from where we were, we're looking at specific chart factors. In the interpretation of charts, almost any factor can be regarded as karmic, or as having karmic implications. We noted in our last episode, where we left off in our last episode, is that although Saturn alone has been called the planet of karma in many writings, this is an oversimplification, because astrology could legitimately be called a science of karma. That is, a way of realizing and accepting one's responsibilities in a precise way. So, any factor can be regarded as having karmic implications. However, there are some specific astrological factors that we should pay special attention to in this kind of investigation of what karma is and means. Many of these are dealt with later in this book in much more detail, but a brief outline of specific things to focus on should be mentioned here. And we start with Saturn, of course. Saturn, often called the Lord of Karma, more closely I would say time, the Lord of Kala, time. Saturn is said by many astrologers to represent the major karmic problem in any individual's life. The planet Saturn has come to be called the Lord of Karma, not because it is the only element in the chart which symbolizes an aspect of personal karma, but because, the position and aspects of Saturn reveal where we meet our most specific and concentrated tests, as well as where we often experience pain and frustration. And since the popular conception of karma is that all karma is negative and troublesome, Saturn's testing is viewed by many as identical with the action of karma. This is, of course, a gross oversimplification, as well as a misinterpretation of what karma really is. It may be more accurate to say that Saturn in the natal chart, especially according to its house position in conjunction, square, and opposition aspects, or the aspects given in the Vedic sense, which is Saturn's third house, Saturn's seventh house, and Saturn's 10th house. But I digress. So the aspects, Saturn in the natal chart, according to its house position and aspects, shows where our difficult karma comes into its most specific focus. These challenging aspects of Saturn show crystallized habit patterns of thought and action which inhibit the flow of our creative energy. Such an aspect can reveal the past misuse of a talent or power with which we must now discipline and redirect into constructive conscious channels. It is in this area that a radical adjustment in our approach and attitude is necessary. Saturn. Such an aspect, and this could apply to a lesser extent to the Western aspects of quincunx, semi-square, and semi-sextile aspects as well. Such an aspect of any sort, including the Vedic ones, and ideally for me the Vedic ones, these aspects generate great energy from its inner tension. And we can use this energy to develop greater awareness and creativity. Saturn is the planet of form and structure, and we often find that the planet in close aspect to Saturn needs to be given a new form of expression. And watch for later on, we're eventually going to divulge more into the nature of Saturn and its aspects to transformation. Saturn, however, is not the only indication in the natal chart of obstacles that we have to deal with. Almost any overemphasis, vital lack, or particularly stressful configuration, no matter which planets are involved, can point to an important need for growth and development. The primary thing to realize, this doesn't even need to do with Saturn. Even to have Mars opposite Mercury says something about us getting in tune with our animal forces without getting scattered by our mental forces, right? Even though there's no Saturn involved. So the primary thing to realize is that life is purposeful, that we have to encounter these various difficulties for a positive reason. As the medium Arthur Ford says, and I quote, oh, I guess I didn't get this one. Oh, yes, I did. Oh, very interesting. Okay, this comes from A World Beyond by somebody named Ruth Montgomery, who I believe was the transliterator for the medium Arthur Ford. So the medium Arthur Ford says, the greater the obstacles in the physical body, the more opportunity for a soul to pay off karmic debts and achieve more rapid spiritual growth. The hurdles are stepping stones if successfully surmounted, and the soul who in flesh body cheerfully meets and overcomes physical handicaps is growing more rapidly than another who seems by earthly standards to have everything to live for. The reward is not in the physical form, but in spiritual development. And the more hurdles that are overcome in a physical lifetime, the less often that soul will need thereafter to return to physical form to round off the rough spots in his character. It's very mystical predilection, but it's just, this is very much what the essence of astrology is really steeped in. But, of course, this is being expressed through this rational reasoning of Stephen Arroyo. through it's like a theological speculation through which we can wrest the practical needs that an astrologer and a psychological counselor can give. So that was all about Saturn. Now we just wanted to give a little bit of context into what Saturn is the law of karma, was it said? The Lord of Karma. What that means, and also the fact that karma is not exclusively the domain of Saturn, was the main point said there. Now we're on another part of the book. We're going to observe how the aspects and elements of a chart reflect on the totality of what karma is and means. The topic of aspects will be dealt with in detail in Chapter 6 of this book, but here we can briefly mention some important points. Now, this is going to get into a Western framework of aspects. This is a debated subject because in Indian and Vedic philosophy, the planets have, all the individual planets have specific aspects for specific reasons, and each one of them is different. Mars hits its 4th house aspect at 100%, its 7th house aspect at 100%, and its 8th house aspect at 100% in the Vedic reasoning. And there's a reason for why the houses from Mars, those specific houses from Mars, are affected more deeply by Mars. But there is still something to be said about the interchange of any aspect between planets. The Western aspects are important, and for all we know, it's hard to say if possibly even the Western is more relevant than the Vedic. They are two different systems. As a cross-cultural interpolator, I have to admit both and succeed with both. At least I'm going to get into the mind state of the Western analysis because that's the type of book we're reading. So forgive me if you're a Vedic person, but take this all with a grain of salt and see if we can relate it to our own theology, right? Aspects will be dealt with later, but generally we can briefly mention some important points as relates to karma, right? In interpreting the birth chart karmically, all the square 90-degree aspects and opposition 180-degree aspects show the necessity of coming to terms with our own complexity, with somehow developing that awareness necessary to encompass markedly different approaches to life. And I would extend this to say that any ill aspects in the Vedic sense with their specific aspects, you could say the same thing. Negative aspects, tough, hard aspects, show the necessity of coming to terms with our own complexity, with somehow developing that awareness necessary to encompass markedly different approaches to life. Now, Stephen Arroyo gives us a little extraneous note here, and I'm just going to read that now. It seems to me a reasonable hypothesis that, at least in many cases, these markedly different approaches to life grow from the individuals having had markedly different sorts of experiences in various past lives. For example, if one were trained as a male warrior throughout one lifetime, and then as a traditional housewife and mother in another lifetime, that soul may be born into this life with, for example, a square aspect between Aries and Cancer planets, indicating the inner tension the person feels even now from such markedly different life orientations and modes of expression. Brilliant little aside. So these, to continue the text, the forces indicated in the harsh negative aspects are at cross purposes and interfere with each other's expression. These forces, therefore, need to be harmonized within the individual, a process which usually takes years, as the person slowly develops new behavior patterns and greater self-understanding. The forces involved in the opposition aspect, negatively implied opposite aspects, reveal opposite and yet complementary pulls towards expression that the individual feels most immediately in relating to others. A need to harmonize the opposite polarity is therefore also indicated in these aspects. But the opposite aspect specifically emphasizes the need to develop more awareness of not only oneself, but also of other people's desires, expectations, and points of view. And this is how karma will meet us, through opposition aspects. The harmonization mentioned above can only occur through the development of a higher awareness of the forces and urges involved. The eminent psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, in his studies of alchemy, often quotes the ancient alchemist dictum, tertium non datur, which means that the third factor, which alone can resolve the problem of opposites and personal conflicts, is not given. Jung goes on to explain that a conflict is never resolved on the same level where it arises, but can be resolved only on a higher level, based on a higher perspective and level of consciousness. Very psychedelic. Hence, the square and opposition and all negative aspecting planets show the areas of greatest tension within ourselves. And I should say, even when you have contradictions, such as in the Vedic astrology, if you have Venus as your Atmakaraka, but your rising sign is, let's say, Leo, like me, that's actually what I have. These are two contrasting elements in the chart that need to be harmonized in the lived experience, even though it's not just square or opposite aspects. So any negative or contradictory aspects in the birth chart show areas of greatest tension within ourselves, but also, a fact which should be welcomed eagerly, the areas of greatest potential growth. Wonderful. Because the negative aspects are these tension-generating elements. It's almost like taking the kinetic energy of a pulled elastic and absorbing that kinetic energy and then throwing it and using it for like telekinesis or something like that. You're transmuting it, as it were. Another factor related to stressful aspects, which I have come to pay great attention to, is the element or the elements wherein one finds the most highly stressed planets. Since the stressful aspects can be considered to indicate areas in which we must learn to refine our nature, to make adjustments, and to build new approaches, it follows that any planet, especially any personal planet, involved in such aspects should be viewed not only according to its own nature and fundamental principle, but also according to the element of the sign wherein it is placed. Since, as I have shown in great detail in astrology, psychology, and the four elements reveal the actual levels of energy and dimensions of life that the individual can immediately experience, then the element of any sign that contains one or more of these highly charged, powerfully stressed planets is inevitably a dimension of life where there is a need for adjustment and refinement. Again, as I'm reading, I can see how the basic philosophical thread of dealing with stressful complication in the birth chart can also be applied to Vedic astrology through their different qualification of what makes a stressful aspect. The element where we find such planets, wherever the stressed planets are, and the element of the sign of that planet's placement, shows what kinds of attachments and desires are strongest for us, what one of the major purposes of this lifetime is, and what areas of life continue to cause us problems and are thus in need of transformation. If a person has a close conjunction or stellium in a particular sign, all parts of which configuration are in a stressful aspect to another planet or planets, the element of that sign is invariably indicative of the dimension of life the person has to work at in some way, either to express that energy more harmoniously and positively, or simply to refine the intensity and grossness of attachment in that area. I think Stephen Arroyo puts more emphasis on these elements than I would. The elements are, of course, important, but the Vedic sense of things doesn't put quite as much emphasis on the element so much as the planetary triad, and what I guess it's the element technically, but you would note, I often say as a Vedic astrologer, I like to point out that you notice that the fire and water signs are all ruled by the same planets, aren't they? Leo, Sagittarius rules a fire and a water sign. Jupiter rules Sagittarius, fire, Pisces, water. Jupiter traditionally rules Pisces. Mars rules Aries, fire, and Scorpio, water. And then the sun and the moon rule Leo and Cancer. Those 4 planets all are in the same grouping. They get along together. They're friends. Their implications mean good things. If you get the moon in any fire or water sign, it will be technically harmonious, except for Scorpio, because that's its debilitation point. If you get Mars in any fire or water signs, it will have a natural attunement to that. Whereas the other 3 planets are on the other side. Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, air and earth. Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius, earth and air. So the Vedic sense doesn't put as much emphasis on elements so much as shared vertices of unconscious agency and intention in what the planets mean, which is naturally expressed as the elemental, the elements. The elements are more of a surface layer of the deeper connection between those 4 planets, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, and Moon, and these other 3 planets, Venus, Saturn, Mercury. But I digress. Now, so I want to get back to the main track of what karma is all about. As one spiritual teacher says, karma is attachment. The birth chart, therefore, and especially the highly accentuated components of the chart, this shows our attunements and hence our attachments and hence our karma. Viewing the chart and one's life in this way puts everything in a new light. The arbitrary, judgmental, and false distinctions between positive and negative features of a birth chart begin to melt away. There are no longer any good or bad charts, aspects, or human beings. We are all part of the vast cosmic drama, and on this material plane, we are all entangled in our own karmic nets. Once this is perceived, the question is, what does one do to detach oneself from our own karmic involvements in limiting patterns of being? How do we discern between which roots are worth keeping and which ones are the weeds of an alien developmental psychology that doesn't afford freedom to the agenda of the soul? How do we detach ourselves from these karmic involvements in limited patterns of being? The consensus that I have been able to discern from the teachings of many spiritual masters is that no amount of wanting, willing, or hoping to become detached or enlightened accomplishes very much. One can become detached from one's old habit patterns only by becoming attached to something better. For example, if a beggar only has 3 pennies and he suddenly drops them, he will hurry after them to protect what little he has. However, if at the moment the beggar dropped his pennies, he saw a $5 bill blowing down the street, he would immediately ignore his pennies and chase after that bill. Hence, we can see that it's not enough merely to become sick of our old self, our old ways of being, and our lifelong conflicts. Since the habit, like the $5 bill is evolution. It's like, screw how I've been. That $5 bill is way more valuable. So I'm going to go for that. But you're not going to go for the better thing until you either realize it or you get sick of the old thing. There's a wonderful Vedic story about how, even in the Bible, Jesus says that the water, if you keep just getting water, you're going to keep needing water. The spiritual source within you, the realization of your own illumination, is that water which you can get, which makes you not thirst for any other water. And you need to taste that spiritual water in order to know what it means to have spiritual thirst quenched. If you just talk about it, you'll never experience it. Hence, we can see that it is not enough merely to become sick of our old self, our old ways of being, and our lifelong conflicts. Since the habit patterns of the past exert a strong and constant pull upon us, and since we feel insecure if we stray too far from those habit patterns, we must find something very powerful to become attached to if it is to pull us away from the karmic tendencies. The only thing that is sufficiently powerful and unlimited to affect this detachment is a spiritual force, or at least the awareness of spiritual agencies of some type that are inherent in us. I leave it to the reader to find the method of attuning to this higher power, which is appropriate for his or her state of development. But whatever the path chosen, the biblical axiom provides us with sustaining faith. Seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened. Very interesting and psychedelic. Trying to pull some practical fundamental to what all this is saying is that some kind of transcendental agency, or at least the opening the space to the idea that our unconscious is attached to a deeper metaphysical spiderweb of possible potentials and capabilities and evolutionary transformation arcs. That is the Godhead, which he's talking about, and treating it, providing linguistic space for that area of the mind is important. You don't have to do it through religious theology, but a lot of astrology and even theological, speculative, astrological counselors use the language of religion because that's what people use, and it's easy to transmit the message. It just takes a real discerning person to know that atheism and theism are representing the same nature of reality. It's just the language you prefer to use. It's the language you prefer to use. Now, we also have karmic signs. And we should speak to them just because they're in the book. Moving on with specific chart factors that reflect karma. There are some karmic signs. I wouldn't put as much emphasis on this because all signs are important to the classification of karma. But there is something to be said about the water signs and certain earth signs. So let's at least read Stephen Arroyo's aside on this. This is karmic signs, zodiac signs. It is unnecessary to discuss here the various characteristics of all 12 signs that might be related to karma and transformation. There are many books of high quality which elucidate what lessons have to be learned and what new attitudes developed for each of the signs. He gives us a little side note here. Maybe I'll just show you guys this side note. Come on, there you go. I wonder if I can get this to stay so I don't actually have to read it. Come on, you bugger. Especially Astrological Triptych and Astrological Signs, The Pulse of Life by Dane Rudyard, Signs of the Zodiac, analyzed by Isabel Pagan, and Reincarnation for the Zodiac, published in England as Wisdom in the Stars by Joan Hodgson, all of which are excellent and penetrating analysis of the deeper meaning of the signs. Now, you can rock that thing, but I'd even more suggest the Vedic. My favorite Vedic astrology book is The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology by Ryan Kirksack, and also Light on Life by Robert Svedova. Highly recommend it. But, all digressions considered, I do want to mention here some aspects of 3 specific signs: Virgo, Pisces, and Scorpio. Of all 12 signs, these 3 are most obviously concerned with crises that can clearly be related to karma. It often seems that Virgo and Pisces people, i.e. those with these signs highly emphasized in their charts, not just people with the sun in these signs, these people have to bear far more than their share of burdens, both physical, drudgery, and duties, Virgo, and emotional turmoil and confusion with Pisces. This is because these signs represent crucial stages in self-development. They're the 6th house is pushing into the reality of others, Libra. The 12th house is falling into the reality of self after having been used to dealing with people. It's Pisces. These signs represent crucial stages in self-development, phases of evolution and growth in which the person must confront the fruit of his or her actions and attitudes. Note that Pisces, the 12th sign, marks the end of an entire cycle of life, and that Virgo is the sign of the harvest. Both signs symbolize a process of purification as preparation for further development. Virgo deals with purification of the ego and of the personal motives behind overt behavior. And Pisces is related to the purification of the emotions and mental images that have accumulated over the centuries. The sign Scorpio can be specifically related to karma because it is during this phase of development that one must honestly face his or her true desires and come to realize the power inherent in them. This is why so many people with a strong Scorpio emphasis have such a strong attraction to mysteries, the occult, forbidden areas of experience, and revelations about afterlife. I will say, if anybody knows me, that I'm Leo rising with my sun in Scorpio, and so is Mars and Pluto in Scorpio, all conjunct at like 16 degrees. I'm really interested in this esoteric stuff as well. These scorpionic people are in touch with the most powerfully negative aspects of their being, and their well-known suspicion and lack of trust in others comes from the fact that since they know how untrustworthy their own emotions and how ruthless their own motivations can be, they naturally assume that other people are similarly motivated. Scorpio is the sign of death and rebirth, and anyone with a major emphasis on Scorpio in the natal chart is torn between clinging to old, compulsive desires purely out of habit and the deeper desire of the innermost self to be reborn. So those 3 signs in particular do bring out, do reflect and relate on what karma is generally. Now, one last bit that's important really to describing the internal subjective dimension of illumination, of experience, of bliss, and of unfolding one's karma within despite whatever wheels are spinning on the outside of the material world. A huge emphasis on the internal experience of the meaning and reason why we're all here is the water houses. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The houses of moksha, liberation, as it is described in Vedic philosophy. The so-called water houses, it's houses 4, 8, and 12, have been called the Trinity of Soul, or the Psychic Trinity. And together, they constitute another major factor relating to personal karma. Although the 12th house alone has been called the house of karmic liabilities in traditional astrology, all karma is a liability, which binds us to the material plane and to a limited level of consciousness. And all the water houses deal with the past, with conditioned responses which are now instinctual, and which operate through the emotions, and hence with karma. At one level, these houses deal with the deepest yearnings of the soul, yearnings which by their very nature are at least partly unconscious. And I should say that this also involves the lord of that house. That's a Vedic teaching that the West doesn't get. For example, whatever sign is ruling your fourth house, for me, I'm a Leo rising, so Scorpio is in my fourth house. That means that wherever Mars is placed, for me, is going to channel the desires, the karma, the rigidness, but also the capacity to be uplifted from that rigidness, wherever Mars falls in my chart. So the lord of the house, the water houses, are important too. At one level, these houses, the water houses, deal with the deepest yearnings of the soul, yearnings by which their very nature are at least partly unconscious. The cycle of the water houses shows the process of gaining consciousness through assimilating the essence of the past and letting go of the residue which has outlived its usefulness. The emotional waste and exhausted emotional behavior patterns must be purged before the soul can express itself clearly, no matter what's shown in your material prosperity in the chart. If you've got emotional, karmic, psychological hang-ups and grippings that stops you from letting the awareness of your consciousness flow clearly, what point are you going to have all these possibilities if you can't let it unfurl from within your psychological open doorways? The emotional waste and exhausted emotional behavior patterns must be purged before the soul can express itself clearly. People with an emphasis on the water houses live within themselves and are extremely hard to get to know, especially if the sun, the symbol of the individual self, is in one of these houses. For me, my sun is in Scorpio, the fourth house. So much of their life energy operates at a subliminal level. So much of their motivation is influenced by irrational, unexplainable, and often bewildering nuances. Their sensitivities are unpredictable, since one never knows what will activate an old memory, irritate an old sore spot, or energize a troublesome complex. All of these houses, therefore, correlate with the need to attain emotional peace and freedom from the past. And anyone with major emphasis on any of these houses in the natal chart, on these houses in the natal chart, has a need to bring to the surface the hauntings and fears generated by past experiences, and to let these feelings be illuminated in the fullness of consciousness. Richard Eidman, an astrologer who has pioneered in reformulating astrological concepts in relation to psychological terminology, states that the water houses can be indicative of various types of fear. Fear of returning to the helpless childhood state, fourth house. Of social taboos, it's the eighth house. And of chaos, 12th house. Where do these fears come from? Obviously from the past, whether from past conditioning and training of a specific type, or from specific kinds of traumatic experiences or shocks. Planets falling in the water houses, therefore, represent urges toward expression, which are colored by karmic patterns, emotional prejudices, or unconscious motivations and fears. They often show the ghosts of the past, which still haunt a person, and the fact that they are at least to some degree unconscious explains why these energy complexes so often tend to undermine the conscious orientation to life. These forces, these urges and energies are, so to speak, waiting to be reborn through our conscious effort, and they will not leave us in peace until we face them honestly and liberate that energy through courageous action, conscious, courageous neuroprogramming. The planets in water houses show what is happening on subtle or subconscious levels. They show sources of in-depth experience in the present lifetime which, although stemming from the distant past, are still alive and constitute a major concentration of life energy. This goes to show why anything transiting one of these houses, like especially heavy planets like Saturn, Jupiter, the north or south node, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, these can bring out blockages in the whole spine of the tree so that the water can be released and our free, unfettered awareness and joy can joyously explore the ramparts of who we are and what our potentials are. You just need to unblock whatever planet going through that water house has to really do its duty to help unblock the constricted planets and themes related to that house, which can be very painful and very internal. Because when these parts of ourselves, as long as we remain unaware of these aspects of our own nature in the water houses, the energy and psychic functions represented by waterhouse planets are unavailable for conscious direction and creative utilization. When these parts of ourselves are made conscious, however, they can come alive with great force. The fact that waterhouse planets often reveal factors in our lives that transcend, overwhelm, or undermine our conscious orientation is to be welcomed, for the ego consciousness often becomes stuck in limited patterns of expression and therefore needs a periodic confrontation with the deeper sources of life within us. Such an experience can be refreshing for the self-undoing, chaos, self-loss, or utter dissolution of the conscious ego personality experienced by a person with major emphasis on these water houses. This can open the person to spiritual insight and illumination. A strong emphasis on the water houses may show that these factors in the individual's life are struggling for recognition, that is, for acceptance into the light of consciousness and awareness. Notice that the word recognition means to know again, recognition, referring to a past knowledge of the factor indicated, which is at present forgotten or unconscious. The negative emotional effects of stressfully aspected planets in these houses can often be ameliorated by consciously recognizing and attending to the life forces so symbolized. Just as the ancients worshipped each of the planets as a deity, i.e., a universal power or law, knowing that the gods' nemesis would surely follow if a person arrogantly ignored the demands of stronger forces. It's kind of psychedelic, really. To outline the specific meanings of the water houses, we might summarize as follows. The fourth house reveals the conditioning which links us to this life's family, home, sense of privacy, and domestic tranquility, and other related security factors. It is associated with the assimilation of our experience in youth, and with the understanding of specific karmic ties with the parents or with other individuals who had a strong impact on our upbringing. It's all fourth house stuff. The fourth house further represents a yearning for a peaceful environment wherein the individual person may feel protected and nurtured. Those who have emphasis on this house not only tend to feel the need for such an environment themselves, but they also tend toward protective and nurturing behavior towards others. Note, however, that certain planets in the fourth house, especially Uranus and Mars, diminish the chances of that person expressing tranquility in this area of life. Unfortunately, I know that all too well with my Mars in the fourth house. The peace for which these people yearn is often sought in a very private lifestyle and or through detaching themselves from the emotional turbulence of parental relationships, either through physical distance or through more subtly coming to terms with their feelings about their parents on an inner level. I'd say astrology is one of the things that helped me work all this stuff out. Now, there's a lot on each of these houses, so I'm just going to give a little bit to each. The eighth house likewise reveals a strong need for privacy, and the person is usually rather difficult to get acquainted with on an intimate level. However, in contrast to the fourth house type of person, this individual is not satisfied merely to have privacy, because they also want power. This is part of the difficulty with the eighth house. This kind of person is strongly motivated to exert some kind of powerful influence in the world while simultaneously maintaining considerable secrecy. And this motivation is usually of a compelling sort, driving the person to exert themselves toward various goals to which they are karmically attached. The eighth house shows past conditioning from previous lives of which we are at times aware, but which still operate instinctively and which derive great emotional power from deeper than conscious sources. Planets in the eighth house show emotional compulsive tendencies which we try to control and usually keep secret, but nevertheless exert a formidable power in our lives. It's difficult to eliminate these urges through willpower alone, as many people with Pluto, Scorpio, or 8th house emphasis try to do. They've got this will and they want to just get it through. But these urges can be transformed or regenerated and refined through a commitment to self-reform coupled with intensity of immediate experience. It's definitely going to have to be some dealing with intense energies coming through and experiencing it. Don't be afraid to experience the depths of intensity and subjective effect that 8th house experiences can have on you. You got to experience them to the full if you can help it in your own slow, take as much as you can, bite off only as much as you can chew, but bite off a lot, more than just a Skittle. Practice taking 4 of these 8th house Skittles, and then practice 10 of them. There's a lot to deal with, but this is the way you slowly build yourself to being able to deal with these ecstatic pressures on the outside, and then will relieve the ecstatic pressures on the inside, or at least help to, if you do it in your own health-conscious time. Now again, we could go into a lot about all of these houses, but I'm going to shorten these a little bit because this is more about karma that we're reading about here. The 12th house, by contrast, reveals influences that are totally and obviously beyond our control. It's often clear to the person with stressful 12th house planets that he or she will not be able to satisfy the inner longings through any ordinary activity, although this clarity may take years of suffering to develop. The yearning for emotional peace found in the 8th house is still present, but here it is intermixed with an awareness of the need for ultimate peace for the soul. Planets in the natal 12th house symbolize forces which often overwhelm us, and which can be dealt with effectively only by redirecting that energy to an ideal that inspires us inwardly toward greater self-knowledge and the devotion to the oneness of all things, and outwardly toward greater generosity of spirit and service. It's a respect for consciousness at its pure unfolding, and an awareness that the only way to neuroprogram yourself is to involve yourself in the material world. This house deals with the process of assimilating a vast array of experience in all dimensions of life, particularly in our handling of responsibilities toward all other living beings. The primary difference, both the 8th and the 12th houses are related to occult and metaphysical studies and practices, suffering at a deep level as a prelude to some sort of rebirth, and an immediate awareness of the realities of psychic and spiritual dimensions of life. The primary difference between the 8th and 12th houses is that whereas 8th house planets have to be confronted immediately and worked through, 12th house planets can often be transcended by just letting this energy pass through you without acting on the karmic energy. In the first case, the 8th house, one brings to the surface the old tendencies in order to actively live in the hot, transformative moment through immediate and intensive involvement. Whereas in the latter case, in the 12th house, one rises above the problems entirely. So one can deduce from the above comments that planets in the water houses have a powerful impact at subtle levels of being. Their influence is therefore not always obvious and easy to interpret. In Stephen Arroyo's experience, the 4th, 8th, and 12th are the most difficult houses to interpret in a natal chart, for one never knows at what level these energies are manifesting. So I'm just taking a brief little go through it, where we should go from here. Yeah, so I'm going to skip to the conclusion of this chapter on the water houses. In short, planets in the water houses reveal that which cannot be found or easily experienced in a satisfying way on the surface of life, but can only be fulfilled in the depths of inner realization. Any planet falling in any water house can thus be interpreted as an aspect of the person's nature, as a dimension of life experience which the person can only fulfill by searching within themselves in order to understand the relationship to it. It especially helps if that planet is well placed in whatever sign that it's in. For example, Mars, in my chart, again, I'm a Leo rising. Mars doesn't do that great in the 4th house, but nonetheless, I'm a Leo rising. Scorpio rules my 4th house. That's where my 4th house cusp is. And Mars is in its own sign in the 4th house. Being in its own sign, in the realm of its own nature, in its own house, where it knows where the spoons and forks are, and it knows how to entertain, and knows how to use this area naturally. It has an easier time acclimating to the implied karmas of the implied and karmic entanglements of the 4th house, just as an example. Especially if it's got good aspects to it from other planets too. The individual must become a seeker, an explorer of the inner realms of being, before they gain sufficient understanding of the inner life to enable them to satisfy the yearning they feel. And I feel like I did that. I had to deeply do that. I was like suicidal, like 3 or 4 years ago, around 2017-ish. Lots of craziness happened in my life in order for me to get a grip on using my Mars in a mature way in my 4th house. Still working on it, but I digress. Hence, planets falling in these houses are indicative of aspects of being which are most problematical when the person is spiritually immature, when they have not yet taken definite steps to know and to face their inner nature and motivations and impulses. It's a very tough thing. Even defining whether we could point out in a person's chart whether they would have those spiritual leanings is like a hard thing to do. But once he or she has perceived the subtler purpose behind these yearnings and the ultimate reason for this temporary frustration and longing, the individual is well on the way to experiencing the necessary transformation of consciousness. It's wonderful writing. So that was basically it for the water houses. Now there's one more planet that specifically relates to karma, which is really going to give us a deep grasp on how to deal with everything that karma is. And everything in our chart, a really good planet to start instigating how you can loosen your neuromatic grip on the prospect of opening yourself to transformation. It's none other than our beloved Luna, the moon. Let's have a read about it, shall we? As usual, folks, this is a live thing, so feel free to make any comments or questions. Now we're at page 19 in our book. Let's go through the moon as it relates to karma. In the present lifetime, the personality is built upon the foundations of the past. Just as the fourth house is at the very bottom of the natal chart, thus constituting the foundation upon which we build our entire operational personality. So the moon, which, by the way, rules Cancer and the fourth house, which partakes of the identical principle, and the moon is a karaka for the fourth house in Vedic astrology. The moon represents our root feelings about ourselves. The moon principle is similar to what many psychologists call the self-image, although the sense of self represented by the moon is not so much a conscious visual image as a subliminal, usually rather vague, intimation of what we really are. It's like it's not our gender, it's not our expression as a man or our expression as a woman. It's this pure awareness and our willingness to open ourselves to the expression of this pure awareness. Astrologers have traditionally associated the moon with the past, whether it is merely the past during this lifetime and related to early childhood conditioning and the relationship with the parents, especially the mother, or whether it's correlated with a broader understanding of the past in the context of the reincarnation theory. It's been stated in many astrological writings that whereas the moon shows the past, the sun shows the present orientation, the pressures which this apparent incarnation is rubbing against the antagonism or the running against the blind, pure, raw, karmic expression. It's been stated in many astrological writings that whereas the moon shows the past, the sun shows the present orientation, and the ascendant points towards future development. That's an interesting thing. I don't know if the Veda would agree with that exactly, but there's no doubt sound reasoning behind these parallels, and on an abstract level, they are probably quite accurate in most cases. However, everything comes together in the present. What we have been continues to influence our orientations, attitudes, and actions in the now. how we feel about ourselves, and what patterns of expression come most naturally and feel most comfortable to us, the moon. They all have great impact on our present mode of living. Just as the moon in our solar system reflects the solar light to the Earth, and thus focuses the life force toward practical objectives symbolized by the Earth, so the moon in astrology represents a general reflection of what we have been in the past. It's an image of assimilated past experience and behavior patterns with which we now feel comfortable because they are familiar and because we have, in fact, exemplified those qualities in our very being. Familiar is a dangerously true word to describe the karma of the moon. In other words, the moon symbolizes, especially according to its sign position, specific mental and emotional karmic patterns which either inhibit or help us in our attempts at self-expression and adjustment to the outer world. Cancer, the crab, is known as adjustment and adaptation. This is why the symbol for the moon, which is the crab, has a shell, and it can bring its home, its shell, its internal fortification wherever it needs to go in the external world. It's kind of for better or worse. If you have a good moon, it means that this thing that you can carry around with you is actually positive, because you can bring this rich tapestry of well-formulated realizations as befits the nature of what you are and what you ought to be now and later in life. If it's well placed. If it's not well placed, then you're dragging a ball and chain of complicated karmic entanglements along with you wherever you go. If the aspects with the moon are harmonious, they reveal past conditioning and patterns of spontaneous reaction that can help the person to adjust to life and to society, and to express his or her self. If the moon aspects are stressful, thus symbolizing an inability to adjust oneself easily to life and or a negative self-image, these emotional predispositions must be outgrown. It's important to note that the moon symbolizes such spontaneous reaction and behavior patterns that these orientations are primarily evident in childhood, when one's behavior is rather pure and uninhibited. Hence, the lunar sign and aspects are most immediately effective in the early part of one's life. As one gets older, it's possible to outgrow some of the old emotional patterns, even to the extent that the emotional blockages shown in the chart through lunar aspects may no longer have any important meaning. This is not to say that the moon sign ceases to be important, for that will always symbolize, the moon sign will always symbolize a dominant tone in the person's fundamental way of being. But I am emphasizing that the problems and conflicts associated with moon aspects and with the expression of the qualities thereby symbolized may be almost totally outgrown or at least adjusted to in a healthful manner. And this is a great thing for anybody who has an ill moon to do, because again, the moon is the central, it's the waterways of the spine of the tree. And how can the tree put water anywhere to any of the fruits and potentials in your chart if there's no water? If there's no psychological door opening towards those potentials. Since the moon is such a complex symbol, and since its meanings are so many and diverse, the most appropriate way of explaining them further is to present a schematic outline. And this is an outline that I have not written, I haven't made a presentation for it, but we're going to go through them. Here's our outline. A. The moon symbolizes the image of oneself that a person sees reflected in his or her dealings with the public. Hence, any stressfully aspected moon aspects can show an inability to project oneself harmoniously in order that other people respond in a positive manner. A harmoniously aspected moon shows that one can express oneself harmoniously in dealing with the public, and that one has a good sense of what the public likes. B. A stressfully aspected moon often shows a markedly inaccurate self-image for how the person feels about self based on past patterns and past identity may not be an accurate description of the person's true nature in the present. They might not have the capacity to reflect on what they are now because of the muddled up water of how they feel themselves to be. This inaccuracy of self-image is often reflected in such behavior as taking things the wrong way, being oversensitive, overreacting to trifles, dressing in a way that doesn't suit the inner nature and true personality, and being too defensive. Now, C. The house position of the natal moon shows the area of life activity where we need to get feedback, where we can come in to see ourselves more objectively, and where we can tune into a sense of self that can provide us with inner tranquility. The vessel, the home on your back, the vehicle through which you can get through the storms of any external situation. People with good moons can do this. That's why they say Cancer can adapt so well. 4. The moon's sign shows how we defend ourselves instinctively. For example, moon in a fire sign reacts with anger. Moon in an air sign reacts with rationalization or argument or discussion, etc. Moon in water with retreat or emotional outpourings. Moon in earth with endurance. E. The moon sign also symbolizes a mode of expression that comes naturally and a mode of behavior where we feel secure. The moon sign shows an old pattern of life which is usually fairly comfortable unless the aspects are too stressful. Moon in Capricorn finds security in age and in acting old, cultivating aged behavior. Moon in Taurus can find security in acting like an earthy peasant. Moon in Leo finds security in dramatic displays, or at least in being recognized. F6, whatever. Since the moon represents a strong urge to express a mode of being that is natural and an intimate part of oneself, the moon sign also shows what you need in order to express and feel good about yourself. As Grant Louis put it, the moon shows the heart's desire. The aspects with the moon simply show how easily one can express this mode of being and how easily one can attain this feeling of well-being. The moon signs, this is like number 7, I believe, it's G. The moon sign symbolizes the practical application of the solar energy and purpose. This is the reason why a sun-moon trine, sextile, or to some extent a conjunction, the full moon is the best, as well as simply having sun and moon in compatible elements. This is a stabilizing and potentially creative aspect, for in these cases, the solar energy can easily be expressed in a practical and functional way related to who the person feels they are and wants to feel that they are. So from all the above, it should be clear how important the moon's sign, house, and aspects are in consideration of karmic revelations in the chart. There's probably no other factor in the natal chart that can be so immediately related to past experiences and past habit patterns. So if you want to work out all the complications, all the difficult transits and depressive transits and all the things possible in the debilitating dimensions of any part of astrology, your moon, the placement of your moon, what it means, how you can digest it, look to the position of moon by house, sign, and aspects to see what's blocking you and also what is aiding you in your developing the internal psychological resources and faith and under self-reflection that can draw you to be honest about yourself and to draw honestly on how this self can earnestly and sustainably move towards the happiness, the release needed to earnestly and honestly examine the difficulties in the chart. We should be careful not to oversimplify the association of the moon with past lives to the point of making statements like, well, you have the moon in Leo, so you must have been an actor in a past life. Such interpretations may occasionally be valid, but they usually have no constructive purpose and may give the client the impression that the astrologer is simply trying to make an impression with sensationalistic statements, a deduction which may be quite accurate. The important thing to dwell on is the need which the moon symbolizes in this lifetime. And the most constructive approach to interpreting charts from the karmic viewpoint is to elucidate the deeper motivations and pressures which the person may feel, but which they have no way of identifying or putting in a broader perspective. Now, I hope you guys dig. The reason why we're going so deeply into these things is because as an astrologer and an astral counselor, it is very useful and important for you to examine the conditions of a person's moon who's coming to you for an astrological consultation. Because if their moon is not in a proper orientation, then you're going to be having two different conversations with this person. They're going to be asking you, how do I be happy with what I am right now? And you're going to have to say to them, you can't. You have to change and transform. If they don't have the psychological development with which to reflect earnestly and honestly and fearlessly on everything that they've been, on everything that they could be, you might have a real hard time. Like, this is a critical pillar to your helping that person unfold whatever other things they might be coming to you for. You know, they might have heard that Uranus, it's 2020 right now, and Uranus is in Taurus right now. And they might be a Taurus rising, and they might have Saturn there, and they might have all kinds of crap happening. And so they might come to you and say, what do I need to do in order to orient myself properly in the midst of this tough transformation? You might actually want to tell them that this is a great time for your spiritual development. But are they going to grasp that properly? Are they going to have the sense of self that can hold a narrative through which to experience the craziness of that karma and constructively and to eat that experience? Or are they just not going to know where to build from? Is there no sense of an eternally recurring self within the transformed states through which they can meditate on and contemplate as the root of themselves with which to build on new experiences through? Are they going to have a sense of a self to pull through this experience? It's a critical thing if you want to do any kind of astrological counseling, as well, of course, the even tougher thing, which is that even me, as someone who aspires to be an astral counselor, everyone's got stuff in their chart related to their moon that they need to deal through, and which is a perfect key to it's a doorway to holding the keys to transformation. It's a necessary vessel, a necessary platform upon which you can engage the keys to transformation that we're going to be talking about later in this book. This is just building on the psychology of karma, which we are going to transform in our further reading. In concluding this chapter, we can say that each of us has the opportunity to harmonize within ourselves the diverse manifestations of the universe. And we have the opportunity to accept all other human beings, even those with whom we strike a discordant note on the personality level. Wonderful. Astrology has always taught me that we are all some kind of colorless light within wherever the sun falls in our individual charts. Can we live without demanding that all experiences and all human beings harmonize with our attunements? Can we evolve a mature, detached consciousness that enables us to watch ourselves play our allotted role in the cosmic drama? Can we laugh at our complexity, our conflicts, and our inconsistencies? Most importantly, can we have faith that the universe is harmonious and that it is only our narrow vision that sees discord? The answers to these questions will determine, to a great extent, how we face our karma in this life and what sort of karma we are creating now. Now, Stephen Arroyo has a little aside for us down here. Many of these tolerant and broad-minded qualities could accurately be called Jupiterian and are needed to cope with and rise above the ups and downs of life and the light and dark of karma. A broader perspective and faithful acceptance helps a great deal, which perhaps is not emphasized enough in this book. This is a note that Stephen Arroyo added in this second edition. Therefore, the reader may want to consult 2 of my other later works regarding this Jupiter principle, each which contains a considerable section about Jupiter's importance in astrology. It's the practice of in profession of astrology, and Stephen Arroyo's Chart Interpretation Handbook, page 77. In fact, we do have it right here. I just want to see if there's anything worth mentioning. Yeah, I mean, you know, while we're here, this is the aside of from Stephen Arroyo's Chart Interpretation Handbook. I'm just going to put it here just so you guys can read it. Come on. This is so hard and weird to do. Come on, you bugger. No one's going to get there. It's like an eyeball. Now, whatever. The importance of Jupiter in the birth chart is underestimated in interpretation and tradition. It actually guides us into the future and motivates future growth and development, especially along idealistic lines. Jupiter's deeper meanings are neglected for the most part, and this is why these guidelines are sometimes more elaborate and detailed than those for other planets. In some ways, Jupiter is too simple a principle for a complex age, and it is too philosophical for a relativistic materialist age, ironically. The Jupiter sign of any person is always a powerful personality tone. That sign's qualities often pervade the individual's personality and character. In many cases, the person has that sign's energy, abilities, and qualities in quite a highly developed state. Although they will often be taken for granted by the person, since that comes so easily and naturally. In short, not all cases, but in the majority of people, Jupiter elevates and ennobles and thus expresses the more generous and positive side of its sign. There's lots more to be said on Jupiter, but look to Jupiter as a critical power that you have, which can be a tool to help you get in tune with whatever complexities are going on with your moon, so that you can get a sense of yourself. Jupiter gives you the energy and motivation and inspiration to deal with the karmic complexities of your moon, if you feel so inclined, and your water houses, what all those mean, in order that you can get a better grasp on the limits of your willingness to bring on new awareness. Very wonderful, important stuff. So this has been a long video. It's an hour and 20 minutes. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to take a little break, and after that, we are going to start going through the second part of this book, which will be basically another 10 pages, whereas that first chapter was like 20. So I hope you guys dig it. I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. We've got one more chapter to do today. But I'm going to have a bit of a break, like I said, so I'll see you guys close to 8 o'clock. Thanks for watching and for everybody who's been enjoying this.